Yeah, I've been reading Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and I read Job yesterday, Esther and Job.
Mm-hmm.
They're good books.
There's a lot in those.
In the New Testament, I like the epistles.
All the letters of Paul or the gospel.
And the epistles and the gospels in Revelation. I like looking at them also.
Pay careful attention to that second question. Get that one right.
He's made it. He's made the big time.
Oh, no. I remember this from the previous.
What's the question?
Is Barry Cottle a pastor? I'm interested in your answer, Barry.
That's probably what's most
Are you
important.
looking it up now?
Bible says no.
Brother Russ, I guess that's why you came that question. That's why you mentioned about in the early lesson to come to that question later, right?
Yeah, if you remember, you've been through this before. And that question was there when we did the class the previous time. So Barry wasn't in the class. It's more fun to have him in here.
It was a lot of fun when I wasn't, and I had like 20 people come tell me I'm not a pastor afterwards and laugh at me.
Ah, you think that's the answer? If that's what they told you, I must have done a very poor job in teaching you. That says more about me than anything else. We're on lesson 6, which is about half the section package there. She lost it? How you gonna lose it?
Because Rachel had to move.
Don't let him blame it on me.
No, blame it on Mom.
He's a grown man.
Yeah,
How can it not?
there you go.
Is it his mom's
You heard that. Right up front here.
Andrew.
Andrew put it on you. Put it on you.
On the third question.
Yes.
And it's just questions like in general, like what time we have in meetings and things like that too, right? Not just.
Yeah, no, it is stuff like that, and but there's a list of things in the lesson. With all kinds of situations, if you think about it. I'm interested in what y'all's answers are when we get to that question.
Oh, okay.
What you think are some of the kinds of decisions that different elders make?
Brother Russ, is it possible you can read, and you read the questions?
Yeah, well, you've heard the second one, but the first one is who are the bishops at Embry Hills? The third one is what are some decisions elders make on behalf of the whole congregation? And the last one is should elders make specific demands of individual members? Should they be telling members sometimes what they ought to do individually?
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Good morning, Sister Teresa.
Good morning, Chester.
All right, it's 9 o'clock, but I'll give y'all a few more seconds to think through these questions. And in a moment or two for a few more to come join us. All right, now that David's joined us, we're ready to go. I was hoping at least one more, if I had said that, we would wait. At least one more ought to come in before we start. All right, so we're not going to answer these questions right now. We'll come back to those in just a few minutes. I keep thinking about what to use or what to say about this slide. We go through it each time. I like to remind you what the title of the class is. And this goes back really toward the end to think about how to approach this study and how to maybe get our attention in a little bit of a different way as we think about what the church is. Putting up that title, I think people have lots of different expectations of what the class would be. I want us, as we go through this, to really try to put aside preconceptions about what the church is or what we think it ought to be, and really put more attention to getting a clear biblical picture of what God wanted the church to accomplish. Why did he give it to us? You really need to think about the church as a gift. It's a valuable thing that every Christian should be grateful for. That God has designed the church to accomplish something on our behalf. And so when you read this, don't think about it so much as an official title of some church somewhere. We're trying to dig into what the scriptures really say about it. Although one of the reasons why I capitalize, sometimes you get these capitalized, don't capitalize. Just the simple convention here, this is the title of the class. I capitalize every word in the title except for like ofs and these. And so that's really the reason why I'm not concerned about it. I don't think we need to get caught up so much in capitalized or not. Let's just take a deep look at what the scriptures have to say about it. I do want to spend a little bit more time than we have a couple of times talking about this slide here and how the class is structured all together. Where are we this morning? Let's just test you out on that.
Lesson 6.
All right, it's lesson 6. We're down here to the role of leaders. But have we already talked about leadership?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, which lesson was that?
4.
It was lesson 4. The rule of Christ. We didn't say leadership, but you get the point. It's how Christ rules the church. If you had to say it in a sentence or two, how would you describe the way in which Christ leads the church? How does he lead his church? Ron? All right, he's the head, but how does he do it? How does he function as a head, I guess is the way I'd like to say it. Teresa?
This is, I was thinking, he leads by example. He set his life before
Okay.
and he leads through the word.
All right, through the word. And in fact, the example that he said, you wouldn't understand what it is unless you've read the word. He's got a message. And the message that's been put out there is intended to be a guide for the church. And yet, we come down to this morning's lesson and the next one too. We're talking about the role of leaders, elders, evangelists, deacons, referring to them as being leaders. And yet, we already said that Christ leads through the word. Do we need these other leaders? That might be one, I think, appropriate question. Do you need other leaders if Christ is already leading? So one thing I want to say is that if we go through these next 2 lessons this morning, Wednesday, keep referring back to lesson 4. And think about how that elders and evangelists and others who have some type of leadership role, how they are limited to within whatever guidance Christ has already given in his word. How he's instructed. And that's very important. Because if you think about a church leader, and you don't have the picture of that leader being accountable to the Word of God, then that leader could lead and could do things and make decisions in a much different way than what we're going to hopefully kind of see as we go through this. So one thing is in these two lessons is to refer back to lesson 4, keep that in mind all the way through. But I actually would like you to already be anticipating the lessons 8 through 13. That truly is the heart of the class. If we're only going to do lessons 1 through 7, let me just kind of jump ahead here to this goal. You see this goal have an accurate view of what Christ's church is and what it's not. And so if you go backwards to here, and we're talking about these first 7 lessons, you could get a lot of information, hopefully, the material's been pulled together halfway decently, about what the church is and what it's not. But it could be that it's mostly just intellectual exercise. We're gaining knowledge. We could pass a test if we made one up about all the facts that we learned in lessons 1 through 7. That's not what this class is about. It's not about gaining a lot of facts. It's really about understanding our personal role within Christ's church and being grateful for the others around us that are a part of the same family we're part of, and knowing what we're supposed to be doing. The role of the leaders here, what I really want us to be able to see is how they relate to the purpose of the church. We could almost do it in reverse. We could talk about the purpose, then come back to the leaders. I don't know which way is best. But we're going to talk about what elders are supposed to do, and then evangelists and deacons, and try to connect it up to what the plan God had in mind for the church. That's kind of how we're going through this as we go forward. I think this morning's lesson touches in many ways on every single one of these goals. It'll teach us something, but it also ought to tell us more about our personal responsibility, even as we talk about these leaders, because especially we manage to get through all the material and talk about what I think is the true and most important aspect of the role of an elder this morning. All right, a couple more thoughts, and we'll come back to some of these thought questions. Well, so we put this up on Wednesday night. I wanted to go back to it from a different perspective this morning. You notice how sometimes the letters are written in the New Testament, especially Paul's letters, and he will address it not this way, but the way we've often pulled up passages. He frequently addresses it to whom? Like to the Corinthians. How does he start it out?
Greetings to the saints.
Okay, he does that. I'm looking for something
Church
else.
of Christ. Some of the church.
The church.
Or saints.
Yeah, well, so here are the saints. So let me just maybe focus for a moment. Here's some about disciples, saints, every saint, faithful brothers and sisters, okay? But there are other ways that he does it, where he just simply says, to the church of God in Corinth, right? So sometimes he just addresses it to the group, the whole group, and says that. I think here he's addressing it to the group too, but when you read, look at especially Colossians 1:2, the saints and faithful brothers in Christ, do you kind of quickly get the idea, that he's writing to a bunch of individual people. There are individuals that make up the group there in Colossae. Whereas sometimes when we just read the church, I don't know, we might not get the picture of people as quickly as we ought to, even though we've talked about frequently. The word ecclesia that's translated church just means an assembly, a group of people. But we don't always think about it that way. The point I'm trying to make here is that when we consider ourselves here at Embry Hills, we need to remember we're both a lot of individuals, and it's important for all of us, every one of us, to be trying to follow Christ to the best that we can, and to be transformed and made into new men and new women in the body of Christ. And that's much of what we talked about in Lesson 5. It's also important, though, for that whole group, the body, to be faithful, to be working together, to be pleasing to God, to be sound in their teaching and their practices and things. So elders as leaders, we'll get to this a little bit later, I think need to be concerned about both of those. How's the church as a whole doing? But if they're not concerned about individual members, you're kind of missing the whole point, aren't you? About what the church really is and who we should work with. All right, we'll come back. Yeah, I forgot, I'm a little bit out of order. I'm going to come back to our questions in a moment. But let me ask you this. I've been saying leaders. I've mentioned 3 leaders, 3 different kinds of leaders. Who are they? You can think back to what I've said. Who are the 3 different kinds of leaders? Okay, you got one?
Elders?
Elders is one.
Bishop.
Deacons?
No. Okay, you're on the right path. Chester gave a second one that I've mentioned.
Deacons.
Deacons, okay, and enjoy evangelists, okay. Those are 3 different roles or responsibilities. Elders, deacons, evangelists. But this morning we're going to focus on elders. Are there other names for elders?
Bishops?
Okay, bishops would be one. Shepherds. And I'll stop you right there for a moment, because I'm going to show you a slide to kind of help describe this. There are 3 words in the Greek language that the New Testament was written that describe this role we're going to talk about this morning. You've just given an English word for all 3 of those Greek words: elder, bishop, and shepherd. However, in your English translations, you may have some other words for those 3 Greek words.
Pastor.
We just mentioned there's one additional English one. So pastor would be one for which one of those words we already talked about?
Elders.
No, not elders. Shepherds.
Shepherds.
Pastors is the word for shepherd. Okay? Well, I'm going to show you this. So we've got a couple. You're on the right path here with this. Elders sometimes can be translated as presbyters or presbytery. I think the reference here in 1 Timothy 4, as I remember, is about the elders, or some translation will say the eldership, meaning here's a group of them working together, all the elders, and you can think of them as the presbytery. When you see the word presbytery, what do you think of?
Presbyterian Church.
Presbyterian Church, right? And there's a reason for that, because the way in which that church is organized, and it's got leadership that keeps rolling up. It's got a very different model of leadership than some of the things we saw in Lesson 4. But it does begin with the idea of presbyters, elders within local groups. And that's one of the reasons why they chose to name themselves what they have named themselves. So elders, or if you have the King James Version, pretty old version, you may find the word presbyter or presbytery there. Here's the other one, our second one. We talked about shepherd. I use the English Standard Version, and most of the quotes and things in this material is from that translation, and it uses the word shepherd. But the New American Standard Bible, New King James Version, all of those use the word pastor. And the reference here is Ephesians 4:11. We're coming back to that. It's a very helpful, very important passage in understanding what elders are supposed to do. And then you have bishop. 1 Timothy 3:1 talks about the qualification of bishops, but that word is not always translated in your English as bishop. Oftentimes it's translated as overseer. And again, I use the English Standard Version. It's that way in it, New American Standard Bible, but also New King James Version uses bishop, and you'll see that frequently throughout. What I want to assert to you is that this is one office. And it's really important, because over time what happened was that these offices or these roles began to diverge into different roles. For example, bishop, 100 years or so after the Bible is written, bishop begins to be a title for the most prominent elder within a local church. And then that bishop began to take on responsibility for more than one church. And so you had maybe the senior elder with the most experience and wisdom and all. And would it be possible to look among a group of elders and think that one has a little more wisdom and a little more experience than the others?
Yeah.
Would you
think-
longer if they've been there longer?
Sure. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the eldership started here. I'd have to say that Sewell kind of stands out at 88 years old as of last weekend, or Wednesday, was it Wednesday night?
Yeah.
Yeah, but there isn't a different role. These are all the same. Let me show you how this works here. So take a look at this. You can see pretty clearly, if you open up your New Testament, that we're talking about one role. That's that first word we were looking at. In wherever he was there on the island of Crete, he was supposed to be charged with appointing elders. Then in verse 7, he begins to talk about the qualifications of overseers. You see the difference? Or of bishops, you could have it. So it's the same thing. Elders, bishops, same. Look at it in 1 Peter chapter 5 in verse 1. Peter begins to talk to elders. So here's again that first word up there. But when he does it, he commands the elders. Here's what you're supposed to do as an elder. You are to shepherd. And he uses a verb form there, and you can see the Greek word. I tried a couple of times to pronounce it in my head this morning, and if I can't do it well in my head, there's no point embarrassing myself in front of all of you. But you can see the similarity in the verb form of the word and the actual noun form, which is that second word, shepherd, pastor, that we have up there. And so he's telling elders, your responsibility is to shepherd. And then the third place is Acts chapter 20, verse 17. It's another place we're going to try to get to this morning. Paul calls for the elders of Ephesus to come down and meet him. And when they do, in chapter 17, verse 17, it calls or describes them as being elders, first word. But then when Paul himself begins to talk to them, he says, you are bishops, or you are overseers, in verse 28. You see how the words are being used interchangeably? So I'd argue with you that these things are really the same office. Is that important? Does that matter, you think? I'm sorry, is it important for us to understand that they are one office? That's really what I mean.
Yeah.
Yes.
I hope I'm not jumping ahead, but something that has really been kind of sticking out to me is one of the first questions you asked is it important that we have this leadership when Christ is the leader?
Yes.
And as you're speaking about how this role, which is actually one role, has been misinterpreted to be multiple roles, I think it's an aspect of humanity that we tend to create hierarchies and we tend to create that leadership where there is not such.
Right.
And we see how this has been misused throughout the history of the church. And so I'd argue that the importance of paying attention to the biblical version of this leadership is the fact that if God had not instated this, we would have done so incorrectly.
We would have done something else, right? I think there's a number of good points that you're making there. And by the way, one of the reasons why these things took on different aspects, and you begin to have bishops taking on a title for a bishop as being more important than an elder and having more role, there's not a bad motive behind it. There's actually a pretty good motive of, wow, we got to be very careful about making sure that nothing happens to the church. And therefore, to be sure that nothing happens to it, we're going to give some men that we trust more responsibility. But what tends to happen is this building of hierarchies and things, and it puts more power into the hands of one person. And if that person does not maintain a true picture of what God wants, it's much easier then to go off into other things that God never asked for, never called on. And so understanding that it's one role, that's one reason why it's important. Yes, Scott.
And I think when we start doing that, start making a hierarchy, it just shows that we're not really putting our trust in God, we're putting our trust in each other.
Yes.
That we need to see this leadership physically in front of our eyes when it's there spiritually. I think sometimes it's just hard for us to notice that just like this group of elders and that's it.
Yeah, I'm much safer when I feel like I know exactly how it's going to happen. Instead of it's work. It's not easy often to go to the Word and to try to determine what it is. All right, so it's one office, it's one role. We can call it different things. And for that reason, let's go back to some of our questions here. Who are the bishops at Embry Hills, at the Embry Hills Church of Christ? Who are the bishops? We have any bishops? Sewell? Okay, well, we got one bishop. Sewell, yeah. He's a bishop. Please don't go off and say that's what we learned this morning. Are there other bishops besides Sewell?
You are?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm one.
So you and.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are two other elders besides myself in the class, Ken and Barry. There's a total of 8 here, or all bishops.
Yes.
Are you comfortable? I mean, be honest, are you really comfortable when we go around calling ourselves or speaking of them as being bishops? Not really. You know, and we sometimes make a big point about let's call Bible things by Bible names. I think what's just as important is to be sure that you call things by a name that conveys truth. And something that's understandable and follows what God has in mind. And that's probably the reason why we don't call ourselves bishops, because it's kind of confusing. But what about Barry's here? And I didn't pick on him because he's in the class. I picked on him because I wanted to the last time I taught the class when he wasn't even in it. Is he a pastor?
Yeah.
He is. He's an elder, he's a bishop, he's a pastor as well. But you again see that word is often taken to mean something a little different than the picture we're going to try to portray this morning from the scriptures about what an elder is. A pastor
I haven't
often.
preached in 11 years, though.
You what?
I haven't preached in 11 years, so how could I be a pastor?
Let's fix that. Let's make him preach again. 11 years since you preached. That's not true.
Sign him up.
All right, there you go.
So clearly I should
No,
not
no,
be a
you're
pastor.
going to start preaching. But I'm going to come back to why he even made that comment, because I think that's important, Steve.
Sometimes because of what's going on in the world, like we have a bishop who's an overseer in a
Right.
different organizational, we tend to avoid things that by calling them their proper names so that we don't misconstrue somebody's idea of what it is we're trying to do. And sometimes we work too hard avoiding that.
Yeah, that's probably right. And this is a word I think oftentimes we do kind of avoid. And Barry said, well, I haven't preached in 11 years, so I must not be a pastor. The reason he said that is because the role of a pastor in many types of churches is like the one key leader that everybody sees up front, the one who does virtually all of the speaking and preaching and all. We talk about evangelists, we'll get to that in the next lesson. But a pastor might kind of combine this leadership role and this teaching role, and it's just, a church would typically have one pastor in that kind of a model. Occasionally we'll have somebody that will come up and they'll ask a question, well, who's the pastor here? And so, depending on whether we really want to have to deal with this or not, we may start pointing fingers around it because there's more than one, which is confusing, but again, sometimes you just don't need to figure all that out. Just to, you know what, I am a pastor. How can I help? What can we talk about? And Barry is a pastor, despite his.
Aren't there several pastors?
There are 8 pastors here. Again, keep that in mind. It's the same word: pastors, bishops, elders. We can call them shepherds too. One role that all 8 men are serving. We can just describe it in different ways. Okay? Yeah, Chester and I got to move on. Go ahead.
Oh, I was wondering why we don't ever get to hear some of these other men, some of these other people preach.
You don't want to hear me preach.
All right. Elders, this is God's plan. Now, if I came in this morning, do not look at your material and try to forget that you actually read it. I know y'all did a great job going through it. But if we just came in and quickly said, what's the first passage that comes to mind if we're going to talk about elders?
1 Timothy chapter 3.
All right. What else? There's one that might come to mind.
And also Titus 1.
Okay, Chester, you're going to have to let other people try to answer something, okay? You got the first one. I need to get the other ones. Would that be the case? He's mentioned 2. Why would those 2 maybe come to mind? 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus chapter 1. Why would they come to mind quickly? We're going to talk about elders. We got to talk about those. Why? Qualifications. And unfortunately, that oftentimes is pretty much the extent of the study and thought about elders, or those two passages. And there's so many more. And I think we might be surprised as you get a scan of the New Testament, how many places elders are mentioned as you go through. Now again, remember, we might not see the word elder. It might be overseers in a place, it might be shepherds, but it's the same role. How many times does it come up? Well, first of all, it comes up in the book of Acts a lot. But it doesn't happen until chapter 11, which is not quite halfway, but it's pretty far into the story of the church before you come to the story about the elders there in Judea receiving some funds from other places and what was going on. I'll come back to that later. Acts chapter 14 is the next reference. Here Paul has gone out on his missionary journey the first time, and as he comes back through the cities where churches have already been established, they appointed elders. Right at the beginning, by the way, of those churches being there. Acts chapter 14. In the 15th chapter, you have a controversy now because you've got so many Gentiles that are being converted, especially through these journeys and things that Paul was doing and work of the Antioch church. Now they need to decide certain doctrinal matters. What are we supposed to do about that? What does God want us to teach them or not teach them? Elders were involved in that discussion. We'll come back to Acts 15 a little bit later on. Acts 20, I mentioned this. Paul had worked for 3 years in Ephesus alongside of the elders. And he calls them together, they have a discussion. So there were elders there in Ephesus, even working alongside of an apostle. Acts chapter 21, we'll come back to this passage. This is a fascinating passage. It's about Paul coming into the city of Jerusalem and meeting with the elders who are going to tell him what he ought to do. Acts chapter 21. And then the letters of Paul. So we've got it in the history of the church. Kind of makes sense. You'd expect that. Now notice how many times in the letters of Paul you get some of this. This is not comprehensive, but it's a pretty good list. Ephesians 4, I told you this is an incredibly important passage. We'll come back to that one throughout many of our upcoming lessons. There it talks about them as shepherds. Philippians 1. Different ways of addressing these churches as he started off the letter. In Philippians 1, he addresses it to the bishops and deacons, or the overseers and deacons. You get both, two different roles there, but you certainly get the elders. 1 Thessalonians 5, elders were to be esteemed very highly because of their work. Not because they were such smart guys, or they were, you want to esteem anybody because they're old and all. None of that. It was because of what they were doing. Their work was what was important. Titus 1:5, we've mentioned that. But also you see how important it was. It's like something needed to be put into order. When there aren't elders, there's something missing here that you would like to have put into order. And the qualifications. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17, it talks about some elders were actually being supported by the churches. Those that were worthy of double honor, who were teaching. Is that an unheard of practice to have an elder who's actually supported by the church, who's also got a prominent role in teaching? I'm like looking for a name,
It's our bishop.
Well, I don't know about. I'm not supported. But I was once for a number of months. That's right. And then, of course, Sewell has been for some considerable period of time. It's an appropriate thing to do. Another passage. Now we're off of the letters of Paul, or to the letter of Peter. Peter talked about elders. And in fact, as he began to address them, what did he say about himself? This is interesting.
Fellow.
Yeah, Peter was an elder. He was an apostle, but he was also an elder. Somehow that was important to carry out both responsibilities. In Hebrews chapter 13, the Hebrew writer has some things to say I really hope we get to before we're done this morning. And finally, the letter of James. See the comprehensive nature of this? You got the history, you got the epistles of Paul, of Peter, of James, you got the Hebrew writer, and it's a busy list too. If you look kind of over, do you see lots of different kinds of activities we're not even completely into them, but we're dealing with doctrinal matters. We're dealing with issues about the unity and personality things we'll talk about later. We're talking about those that are sick. We have some very specific things said here that elders are to be concerned about. Busy list. Lots of things to talk about as we go forward. Teresa.
When I was studying, it made me thankful that it's always elders and that not one church just have an elder, because you get, well, really looking at the responsibility, it would be too much for one man.
Yeah, it's very good. In fact, I appreciate that. I was chuckling because I knew there was something else in my notes here besides the fact that this is a busy list. The other thing was, it's always plural. And that has to be a very significant thing. And part of it is just the help. I can give you all kinds of personal examples of why it's been important for there to be more than one elder. And how difficult it is to try to do this work if it's really down to just kind of one person or your own wisdom or own thinking. But look back over that list and spend some time reading it. That list is in your material. It just talks about elders. Oh, it doesn't have this picture of an elder having the one responsibility for a church. It's a group. And a lot of reasons, perhaps, why God wanted to do this. Very good. Steve.
Just a quick question. You mentioned earlier about one of the duties of the apostles was going around appointing elders fairly quickly as the church was being established.
Yes.
I think that the people back then were a different breed, or, I mean, now we may spend a couple of years trying to decide if somebody's qualified or not.
Right. I'll give you a guess. Okay, and a lot of this, in fact, I really should have said toward the beginning of this material, on every page, you know, I've said my name is there, contact information. I need to be held accountable for the material. If you have questions, you don't agree with something, or you want to know more about it, whatever, you can track it down and find me. This material, though, this particular lesson, really has come out of a lot of study and work that Marty and I have done together in different places. But part of it, quite frankly, is pretty much a plagiarizing of Marty's material. I just kind of brought it right into that. And one of the things that he says when we go out and teach about elders in other places makes a lot of sense. He will do a study back through the Old Testament about those that are called elders. And there's a consistent picture through God's people of looking to those that are older, have more experience as being leaders. And so one of the thoughts is that some of those early churches, because so many of the converts were Jewish individuals who knew the law, who knew things about the real God and all, and were already seen as being elders perhaps in those places, it was easier to appoint them to this role. There may have been more that were really qualified and ready to go from the beginning. And what in our mind makes sense when you think about, well, the church just got started. They just became Christians. They've only been Christians for 2 weeks, 2 months, and now they're saying they're elder. It may be they were much more qualified than we are. Just a possibility as you go through that. All right, but what are they to do? And I think this is important because this is a discussion we don't often get to. We talk about who they are, how, what qualifications there are, but what are they actually supposed to do?
Be able to teach.
And that they should be able to. That's part of the qualification. It's one of the qualifications, I think, that does say something that they do. Not all those qualifications speak beyond character. That actually is one that does. But here's a list. Let's begin to look at some of these and think about it. In 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17, I was talking about those elders that are able to be worthy of double honor. He starts by saying they are ones who rule well. And the idea of ruling or leadership is connected with the elders. Elders are to make decisions. We'll see some places in which it would be really valuable to have them do that. Sometimes you'll have it said that elders are really only lead up your Bibles to 1 Peter 5. I'm going to look at a couple of verses here. Andrew, I'm going to ask you to read this if you don't mind. 1 Peter 5, 2 and 3. And you can start as soon as you're there. Remember verse 1, Peter's addressing so
eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory.
Okay, that's good. So if you look at verses 2 and 3, I think in what he says for them to do, there's a number of implications out of it. Some of these are kind of said almost in a negative way. For example, he says here that you're not to do this for shameful gain. If they're able to do it for shameful gain, what does it kind of imply that elders are involved with? Yeah, you got it, Ron. Financial gain. There's some decisions they're going to make related to the offering that has been made. And so that implies some decisions. What about the idea of exercising oversight? You see that? Or not domineering over those in your charge. If I'm not to domineer, what does that say about the potential of that? Is it possible that an elder could be domineering and forcing things on? Think about Diotrephes and, was it 3 John? You know? Now, what that says to me, though, is that obviously they must have some degree of power and authority. Otherwise, there wouldn't be the possibility of them abusing that. It's saying how to use the authority that you have, but there is an implication that there's some authority in that, and they're going to be making some decisions. We'll talk about it. Oh, there's another thing in here, too, you might pull out. The idea that they're not to be serving under compulsion, like made to do it, like you have to do it. I might even kind of speak to the idea there's some type of process of selecting those elders, and they're being willing to do that. Ephesians 4 and 11, though, is really important in understanding what they do. Go to Ephesians 4. If you're not that familiar with this passage, I hope that you'll begin to read it frequently from about verse 10, 11, down through verse 16. There's a picture made of how the church is working as a whole. But it begins by saying that God has given some gifts to the church in verse 11. What are the gifts that have been given?
Apostles.
Apostles are one. Prophets, you got that?
Evangelists.
All right. So when we come back to evangelists in our lesson on Wednesday, you think we'll go to Ephesians 4:11?
Pastors and teachers.
But it also talks about pastors or shepherds and teachers. And whether those are two different roles or not, some believe the word there is actually connected, that it's teaching shepherds. And that is part of what elders or shepherds are to do. But what they are to accomplish, the gifts, these are gifts to the church. What are they supposed to do? Well, you look at the verse or two after that, verse 12, to equip the saints for the work of ministry for the building up of the body of Christ. Whatever the purpose of the church is, and I think this is the heart passage for what we're going to look at, what the purpose of the church is, whatever that purpose is, elders are supposed to be equipping, putting into the hands, preparing all the members to be able to accomplish that purpose. Pretty hefty role. But that's the idea of the elders here. Pray for the sick, Ephesians 5. And then there are all these situations. I said that they ought to be making decisions. Think about how much better it was for the churches in Judea. They're in a time of famine. They have great needs. And now churches from other places send money to those churches so that they will be able to take care of this bad situation they're in, this famine. How would you like the funds that those churches receive, decisions to be made about how to get food to those that are in need? You want to do it through a business meeting of 40 or 50 men? Or do you feel like it might be taken care of better if there's a handful of leaders who have that responsibility to take care of it? You understand some of the wisdom behind that? There's some situations in which it's essential for somebody to have the authority and responsibility to make some decisions. And they did that. In doctrinal matters, in Acts chapter 15, trying to decide that. And then you have this personality issue. I want you to turn over to Acts chapter 21. This is really interesting to me, and then I'm going to actually watching the time. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in the lesson. We'll jump back. But this one's important. Among the decisions that elders make, that we make here, is somebody comes and wants to be a member, place membership. Well, okay, that's important, and you want them to be part of the group. Some things that are important to ask about that. One are some things to determine whether or not they really are a saint, a brother, a sister. Because remember, the church is made up of those. So we'll oftentimes talk about conversion. How'd you become a child of God? But what if somebody came here and you knew that there was a church somewhere else and they were all upset with this person and there were issues about that and something needed to be done perhaps to address where they've been before and they're coming here? Who would make those kinds of decisions? In this case, in Acts chapter 21, the person coming to Jerusalem is the Apostle Paul. And as he comes into the city, he meets, notice the first thing he does in verse 17, he says, the brothers received us gladly, and on the following day, Paul went in with us. The us is the writer of Acts. Luke is saying, Paul and me and the other guys with us, we went and we met with the elders there in Jerusalem. And then Paul tells them, this is what's been going on. I've been out here teaching all these Gentiles, and they said, that is great, wonderful work. And then they say, well, you know, Paul, there are thousands of Christians here who are Jewish who've heard that you're saying don't have anything to do with the law and circumcision and things like that. You're changing all of our cultural things. That wasn't true, by the way, about Paul. So what are we going to do about this? Here's this Paul. He's coming into the city. He could cause some dissension, some disunity among the church. Who's going to be responsible for protecting the church there in Jerusalem? Elders are. But what if the possible source of trouble is an apostle? See, innocently, but still it's an apostle. Would the elders have some responsibility to say, here's what we think ought to be done? To provide for unity and peace and harmony with what God really wants. That's what they do. They tell Paul, Paul, here's what you ought to do. And he does it. Because that's the kind of responsibility that elders have sometimes, is to make for that sort of peace. All right. It's an interesting chart. I'll explain it to you on another time. If you want to, I got to move ahead. I would like to suggest this to you. I'd like to suggest again that elders are responsible for two aspects, or two ways of thinking of their work. One is that they lead the whole body. There are just a lot of decisions that have to be made that affect everybody that's here. And if you'll indulge me, I like to think of the description as being flock shepherd. Sometimes shepherds make decisions for the entire flock. You're going to take the whole same place and make sure that it's a good, good walk, safe to be drunk, that sort of thing, right? Are there times, though, when a shepherd will be concerned about one individual sheep? You think about that even from a biblical perspective.
Yeah.
What comes to mind?
When in the Gospels, when Jesus mentions about the one sheep of 99
That's right.
Scattered.
Yeah, so the 99 are together, but one has gone off.
Yeah.
And the shepherd goes after the one sheep.
Yeah.
That is sheep shepherd. And you got to assume also that the shepherd also made sure that the 99 were in the right place, kind of took care of the flock first, but then went after the sheep. And that really is the work of elders. I've done a really poor job of kind of getting to what I want you to focus on, which is this second aspect. The first aspect is important. It is important for elders to be concerned about the whole church. But I don't think that's the heart of their work. And I think it's forgotten sometimes that what elders really are supposed to be doing is paying attention to every single person that's a part of that group. Every Christian. And passages like Hebrews 13 verse 17 are pretty intimidating for elders, but really what they should be focused on. Now this one, the verse goes as those who will have to give an account. That's intimidating. Elders should think every everyone that's a member here, I may say, well, why didn't you take care of, why didn't you pay attention to this member? Did you, when they ask you to help them, why didn't you do those things? Are you not concerned about their spirit being able to do that? Now, our back to able to do that work met with those. And I oftentimes will ask, who are the two prominent examples given for elders? Or two men that were not elders. And here, Paul's example to you should be, if you'll indulge, I know it's past time, to Acts chapter 20, about how he acted as how he wanted them as elders to act. He said, for 3 years, I did not cease to admonish everyone with tears. That says you're emotionally invested and you're concerned about every single person. And you'll notice how important the word is in terms of doing the work. I didn't shrink from declaring you anything that was profitable, teaching you in public and from house to house. Not just a public role, kind of the whole church elder gets up in front of everybody, closes out the service, but you're from house to house. You're engaged and involved in the work of individuals. But verse 35 is especially important because what he weighs is what's the most important thing? What do I most want you to remember? He says, help the weak. Elders are to be especially concerned about those that are weak in their faith. Don't know the Lord that well, just beginning, striving to become that new man and all, and should be very careful about anything that's done that harms the weak. That's where the focus of that word is. All right. I had a lot more to say. Sorry. Sometimes we do these sessions and it takes 6 hours on a Saturday. You got about 10 minutes.
First one about 2,000 years ago.
Yes.
We'll take a
Well,
small
so
What year is it?
generally thought that Jesus died 30.
But you know,
Yeah, there's some confusion in the calendar, but let's